Sony has created some of the most iconic technology that has ever existed. Sony has made the Walkman, the Blu-ray player, and most notably, the PlayStation. The PlayStation is a brand that has iconography across the world, and it paved the way for some of the most iconic game franchises of all time. So today I thought we'd go through the entire history of the first ever PlayStation. But before we do that, let's see how the PlayStation came to be. Sony was founded on May 7th of 1946 by Akira Morita and Masaru Ibuka. They first started out as a rice cooker company before turning to electronics. Throughout their first few decades, they made radios, Walkmans, and CDs. They kept with making CDs until the late 80s, where they saw video games as a viable market. In 1988, they approached Nintendo about making a CD add-on for the Super Famicom, but plans for that project fell through, so, pretty much out of spite, Sony made the PlayStation. The invention of the PlayStation is chalked up to Ken Kutaragi. Kutaragi is now seen as the father of PlayStation. He served as PlayStation's CEO from 1994 to 2007. The PlayStation was formally unveiled at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas in 1991. And this is where this famous moment comes from.
$2.99.
Oh shit, this man just ended their whole career. Oh my god, what a savage. Damn. After 3 long years, the PlayStation was finally released in Japan on December 3rd, 1994, and in North America on September 9th, 1995. One of the things most notable about this version of the PS1 is that the controller doesn't have the iconic 2 analog sticks. The original PS1 did not launch with the DualShock. It launched with this, which only had a directional pad. You could chalk this up to the fact that 3D games were pretty new, so the PS1 kind of had to adapt to the way that games were made. So later, when games got more advanced, they adapted the controller to fit this more modern style of game. Now let's run through some of the most major releases that came out for the PS1. As one of their first major titles for the platform, they had Final Fantasy VI. This game ended up releasing on April 2nd of 1994. Even though this is one of PlayStation's first ever games, this really seemed to fall under the radar, even with this being a Final Fantasy game. And that was because of Final Fantasy VII, which would release much later. Final Fantasy VI seemed to be a good game, but it got really overshadowed by Final Fantasy VII. The next game on the console was Tekken on December 9th of 1994. This was Sony's first ever exclusive for the PS1. For Sony's first ever exclusive for the console, it's really weird that they chose a fighting game. They didn't really choose a game with a genre that could really be graphically impressive. This game was first in arcade machines before it was ported to the PlayStation. So PlayStation's first exclusive was an arcade port. But this release seemed to work well for Sony because it ended up selling 1.7 million copies. It also released 2 other sequels on that same platform and then later a franchise. Next, we had Resident Evil on March 22nd of 1996. Yes, the beloved Capcom franchise Resident Evil got its start on the PlayStation. This would later become Capcom's best-selling franchise. The Resident Evil games up until this point have sold 107 million copies. This first game in the franchise was really unrecognizable from the other Resident Evil games. The 2 major differences were the fixed camera angles and more of an emphasis on puzzle solving and horror rather than shooting. Next, on June 29th, we had Street Fighter III Alpha. Street Fighter III Alpha is a prequel to Street Fighter III. Now, this game is weird because it was released on the PS1 before Street Fighter III, and Street Fighter III didn't come out until the PS2. So it's strange that they released a game so closely connected to Street Fighter III when that game wouldn't come out until the next generation. So to play the actual Street Fighter III, you would have to get a whole new console. That seems kind of scummy in Sony's eyes, because now if you already played Street Fighter Alpha, then you have to go and buy a PS2 for $300, and then you can play the actual Street Fighter III and finish the story. It's really sucky for Street Fighter fans and people that actually wanted to play this game, but it worked out for Sony because it probably made them more money. Just a little bit more money, but money is money, I guess, when you're a multi-billion-dollar corporation. The next game of note after Street Fighter III Alpha was Crash Bandicoot on September 9th. Crash Bandicoot 1 was a somewhat challenging 2D platformer that was developed by Naughty Dog. Crash Bandicoot 1 is somewhat of a rarity for PlayStation. We don't really see Sony make very many 2D platformers anymore, and that's mostly because of Crash Bandicoot and the success it had. Crash Bandicoot 1 ended up selling 1 million copies on the PlayStation. This isn't very many copies in hindsight, but it really started to build the PlayStation brand. Crash Bandicoot came out at a time where they were trying to rival something like Mario 64. Mario 64 had been out since June, so this is a way for there to be a rivalry in the 3D, 2D platformer market. Because until Crash Bandicoot came out, Mario 64 was just kind of dominating a whole genre. There was no competition in the platformer genre, so Crash Bandicoot was the answer to that. Crash Bandicoot may have not been as successful as Mario 64, but it did leave its impression on the PlayStation brand. After the release of Crash Bandicoot and then what would become a franchise, we had Tomb Raider, which is another start to a franchise. And this came out on October 26th of 1996. The older Tomb Raider games are really a product of its time. The character models are a little clayish, and the camera's annoying, and the shooting mechanics aren't yet as fine-tuned. But people don't really seem to care about that. You know what people care about this game for. Moving on, we had Tekken 3 on November 28th. As the third game in a series that came out annually, this was received pretty well. This game ended up selling 6 million copies, whereas the first game couldn't even sell 1 million. So this franchise really took a minute to get rolling. Now, moving on to 1997, on January 31st, we had Final Fantasy VII. Now, this is the one game that people always talk about when they talk about the PlayStation. There were so many Final Fantasy games before this, and there was already Final Fantasy VI on the PS1. So what made this game so special? It was probably because the story was better, and it was better reviewed, so that made it sell better. Because this is one of the best-selling Final Fantasy games of all time. This is also one of the best-selling PS1 games of all time. On August 27th of 1997, one of the most influential and most drastic changes to the PlayStation occurred. On this fateful day, the DualShock finally released. The DualShock was the revision to the original PS1 controller, and this included 2 analog sticks. And this was significant because no other console had ever had 2 analog sticks, and mostly every controller after this point had 2 analog sticks. So I guess you could thank the PlayStation for standardizing this design. On October 21st of 1997, we had the first ever Grand Theft Auto game. This was way different from modern Grand Theft Auto. This game was more archaic in its style, and it was a top-down game as opposed to a open-world game. There was a lot of content in this game. It still had a ton of missions, and it still had a lot of fun things you could do, but with the limitations of the PS1, you couldn't really go all the way with this concept just yet. Next, on Halloween of 1997, Crash Bandicoot 2 came out. Man, some of these development cycles on some of these games are really, really short. So this kind of sucks in comparison to newer games, because these development cycles are way too short for people to come up with new ideas. I feel like sometimes you need that longer development cycle so you can come up with new ideas. Because if you have these short development cycles, you're not really changing a whole lot. And that's probably just because of the time constraint. Because overall, Crash Bandicoot 2 was just more of the first game. To round out the year of 1997, on December 23rd, we had Gran Turismo 1. What a great Christmas gift for the year of 1997. This game would start a franchise that would become one of PlayStation's flagship franchises for years to come. This franchise would end up releasing games very regularly. And this is very significant because this is still one of Sony's IPs that they own that is still having games made for it. Crash Bandicoot was ported to other platforms in 2017 with the Insane trilogy. Spyro the Dragon also got the same fate with its remastered trilogy. And Tekken became cross-platform with Tekken 7. Next on the list, we have Resident Evil 2 on January 21st of 1998. This is pretty much the same as the first game, but what's significant about this game is that it would later be remade, and it would look completely different. Resident Evil 2 also has a version on the N64, but it's really stripped down, and I would not recommend playing it. On September 3rd of 1998, we had Metal Gear Solid 1. Before this game came to be, Hideo Kojima initially wanted to make a fourth Metal Gear game, and this fourth Metal Gear game would be released for the 3DO. But because plans for that fell through, he decided to go to PlayStation, and he reevaluated what he wanted to do with the Metal Gear series, and started on Metal Gear Solid. This new series, based on Metal Gear, became infinitely more popular than Metal Gear ever did, and thus became a staple of PlayStation. On September 9th of 1998, we had Spyro the Dragon. This game was developed by INSOMNIAC, which should be familiar to some people. INSOMNIAC's first ever game, Disruptors, was a commercial flop, but Spyro the Dragon really put them on the map. The Dragon was INSOMNIAC's second game, which was a success, so I guess second time's the charm. On October 31st of 1998, Crash Bandicoot 3 came out. This was exactly 1 year after Crash Bandicoot 2. Now you see what I mean about these development cycles. But now Naughty Dog was getting to the point where they could fully utilize the PS1 hardware, and this meant that Crash Bandicoot 3 could look as good as possible with the PS1 hardware limitations. But besides that, this is still just Crash Bandicoot. I don't really know what else to say anymore. On January 31st of 1999, Silent Hill came out. I'm starting to notice that they like to release these games on either October 31st or January 31st. This is a pretty late PS1 game, and it's also one of the best PS1 games. Somehow, a game revolving around a cult and kids became a cult classic. On December 17th of 1999, we got Gran Turismo 2. I would pretty much just call this a reskin of Gran Turismo 1, but with a few different tracks, and that's pretty much it. On September 30th of 1999, we had GTA 2. This was still in the same top-down perspective as the first GTA game. This was the first ever GTA game to include saves, so it had that going for it. Other than that, it was kind of just the same GTA game as the last one. It had a lot of the same mechanics and world that the original GTA had, so there isn't really much difference between the two of them. So in my opinion, if you want to pick up these games now, I would just pick one of them, because you'll get the same experience that you'd get from one that you'd get from the other. On October 31st of 1999, we got Tony Hawk Pro Skater. Now, I've always been fascinated by how this game series came to be, because this game series is hailed as one of the best sports series of all time. The start of the series was pretty much just a deal between Activision and Tony Hawk. Since Tony Hawk was pretty much at the height of his career during this time, Activision wanted to capitalize on it. And this really worked out for both Tony Hawk and Activision, because this is one of their most beloved franchises, and Tony Hawk has made an estimated $500 million off these games. On July 7th of 2000, the PS1 came out. Weird naming scheme, a little confusing, but anyway, this was a revised version of the original PlayStation, which was a lot slimmer, and it had the ability to attach an LCD screen to the top of it. And having the ability to attach an LCD screen to the top of it would make it portable. This is all in all the more reliable model, because it's more refined, and it fixed the problem where the PS1 would stop reading discs. There used to be this little, quote, life hack where you would have to turn the original PlayStation upside down to get the games to read if your laser went out, and the PS1 fixed this problem, so you didn't have to do that anymore. On September 19th of 2000, we got Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. This would complete the duology that would later re-release on the PS4. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 on its own is pretty much a rehash of Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1, but together with Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2, they're pretty damn good. So good, in fact, that they decided to re-release them for newer generations of consoles. That is all the games of note that came out for the PS1, even though the PS1 didn't die until 2004. The last game on the PS1 was, of course, another fucking soccer game with FIFA 2005. Show me one PlayStation console that doesn't have their last game be a soccer game. Anyway, the PlayStation was a great success for Sony as their first dabble into the console market. Out of Sony's pettiness, they made a giant brand that is recognizable across the world. And in all honesty, I don't know if I should respect them or I should shame them. But at the end of the day, Sony made one of the best decisions that they will probably ever make, and that was starting the PlayStation brand. The Sony PlayStation 1 ended up selling 102 million units. And this would start a big and bright future for Sony.